Good morning everyone, it's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm Richard Hammond, I head up our work here at CC in synthetic biology. It's relatively new for us, so I rejoined the company about 5 years ago with a very specific mission to try and build our capability into biology. Basically, we saw some very interesting trends about what was going on and we wanted to be part of that. So I came back and we're trying to do it ever since. So synthetic biology is a relatively recent discipline, but the core idea is trying to bring engineering ideas into biology. It started in academia, we're now seeing it coming out much more into the mainstream, which is why we're getting involved. So this morning I'd just like to talk a little bit more broadly about bioinnovation across some sectors and some of the projects that we've been working on, and some of the big challenges that we're taking on. Synthetic biology is really trying to do some seriously difficult stuff about harnessing the mechanisms of biology to design new solutions to difficult problems, and we'll explore some of that this morning. So there's been enormous advances in the understanding of biology over the last 50 years, everyone knows that, but how do you go from cool science, just really interesting things happening in a lab, to the really big issues, the big global issues that are out there? And how do you do that within realities of business? You know, there are always questions of timeline and budget and ROI, and you can't just ignore those. So hopefully this morning we'll have a bit of a think about that and some of the insights that we've learnt. So where I'd like to start is actually with the term bioinnovation. And the definition I've shown here is actually taken from the World Economic Forum. And what they describe bioinnovation as is advances in biotechnology, but coupled with evolving economic and governance models. And I think that's a very important part of it. There's a much broader set of thinking going on here, that it's not just the core technology, it's the environment and the context in which that has to exist, particularly in terms of the economics and the governance of that. This particular example they've taken from agriculture, where the Economic Forum was first looking, but I think it's very generally applicable. And at the heart, it's quite a straightforward idea. If we're talking global issues, you've got to think about more than just the technology. Technology has to exist in a context. You've got the bioinnovation in the lab, but equally important, the interests of the stakeholders and the rules of the game. And that typically is the governance models, the rules, and typically the economic models. That's how the interests are expressed. So who pays, who benefits, and what we as a society are willing to accept in terms of risk and reward. So bioinnovation is a bigger thing than you might first think. And we've adopted this phrase because we recognise the breadth of thinking that's necessary, and it highlights how impact things like synthetic biology can have on society. Our main focus is technical, kind of seen that this morning, but we're acutely aware of these other issues. And we know you can't just sideline them or ignore them. As an example of that, we were involved last year with an EU project around smart maps, which was looking at responsible innovation and tools for industry about doing responsible innovation and bringing some of these ideas out in a way that works with broader stakeholder interests. So that's what we're saying about bioinnovation. It's a much broader thing. So is bioinnovation relevant then? So what are these global issues? And I would suggest that it is extremely relevant. So if we look at some of the major issues on the globe today, let's talk about climate change or access to healthcare or how we're feeding the planet. There are some big questions out there, and I think everyone's comfortable with the fact these are coming up in people's consciousnesses, and the idea that it'll all be okay is not really working anymore. We're starting to see this, I would suggest, politically. So those of you familiar photo, I'm sure, so that's Senator Edward Markey, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and this was introducing the ideas around the Green New Deal back in February in the US, which we found very interesting, that there's this sort of political view that the current status quo is not good enough and we have to do something about it. Now the New Deal is very much around a combination of economics and climate concerns. But biology has to play a key part in delivering these kind of thinking. There's got to be deep discussion around governance, of course, and making the right balance between resource allocation and the extent to which we're willing to modify natural systems to try and solve some of these problems. But I think you can see that the idea of engineering biology has massive relevance to some very big problems in the world, and there's an element of politicisation and visibility of this that we've not seen before. So we know what bioinnovation is, And I would suggest it's a very relevant concept. But what about the cool science bit? Now, some people may be familiar with these, others not. This, to be honest, is just a list of things that I've been hearing about recently. We did a little project with the Cambridge Centre for Existential Risk. Brilliant research group. If you want to do research into existential risk. They do a horizon scanning programme. They're looking into the future and saying, what can we see that's coming? And in particular, we're doing one around bioengineering, and we take part in that. And these are some of the things that came out of just people are aware are happening in the cool science place. So the first one, bioplastics, that picture you can see there, this is something we're working on. So that's actually that photograph came out of our lab about a week ago, and that's a strain of E. coli making PHB, polyhydroxybutyrate. It's a lovely photograph, but you can see the sort of fractal nature of it because of the different cells, the different organisms expressing at different rates. So the idea of bioplastics. Let's make plastic using biology. Really interesting work going around SC 2.0, Cerevisiae 2. So this is an academic endeavour over many few years now in many groups to totally re-engineer the yeast genome, totally rationally design the yeast genome from the bottom up. They want to do that firstly because it was this great insight into the mechanisms of eukaryotic organisms, but it also allows you to really start designing it as a chassis for making stuff. And they're doing some really interesting things there, with things like Scramble, where they're able to completely rearrange the genome and see what happens. Some very powerful tools. But ultimately, they will have a completely synthetic genome for yeast, which you can then rationally work with. Some work George Church is doing over in the US. Let's make transplant organs in pigs. So let's grow the organ within a pig, which you engineer so that it's actually suitable for human replacement. Brilliant idea. There's some interesting questions around governance and where you might take that technology, but it's happening. Cell therapies. People are probably familiar with these now. That the idea you're taking cells from yourself, from a human, and reprogramming them to fight a given disease state. So the one that's most known at the moment is CAR T, so using T cells to do blood cancers, leukemias, that kind of thing. That's becoming very real. Gene drives. This one comes up quite regularly now. Typically, you've got a 50-50 split, and when you have a population that's moving forward, there's a distribution of genes. You can engineer that, push it, to get up to 100% lineage of your trait. So you can wipe out a species if you wanted to, and you could completely change an ecosystem. Now, that might be a very good thing if you're thinking pests, but what are the consequences of that? And what do you actually do with that technology, both potentially for bad as well as good? Phytoremediation, I love this one. So this is the idea of growing plants to clean up the land. So if you've got industrial contamination, or often in war zones, where you've got a very contaminated land, how do you clean that and make it usable again? The idea of let's use plants and engineer them to pull the materials out of the soil. Or edible vaccines. Most of the small molecule drugs came from plants originally in many cases. We can now make vaccines in plants. Why can't we just eat the plants to get the vaccines and manage that whole supply chain much more straightforwardly than we do today? Now, some of these are very early stage, clearly. We're not there yet. But it gives you a feel for kind of some of the cool science that's out there, stuff people are working on right now. So we've got this position, we've got these big global issues, and we've got all this very cool science going on. So how actually do we try and join the two together? And the way we're thinking about this, the underlying principle is to think of biology as technology. So it's like other technologies. It's not something totally different or unreal or unknowable. It's a technology that you can understand and work with it as you would do with other technologies. We can predict it, we can design, and we can execute. Now, I first saw this about 10 years ago. So I was doing a lot of work in diagnostics at the time. And I started off doing a lot of immunoassay work. And the biology was pretty artisan. We were Rabbit 29 sticks in the memory forever, dear old Rabbit 29, had a brilliant antibody against strep throat, strep A, and we couldn't replicate it. And dear old Rabbit 29 went to the great bunny heaven in the sky, and that was it. We couldn't make the product anymore. Not great. So the immunoassay world was pretty tricky and artisan. I then got involved in molecular work, particularly isothermal amplification. I went to see the scientists and tell me how it works and what you're doing, and they explain the concepts of primers and probes. And then one of the scientists said to me, yeah, we'll design a primer. And I stopped and said, did you say design a primer? He said, yeah, that's how we do it. And it was the first time I'd ever heard the word design in a biology lab. And it was like, whoa, that's interesting. I've never seen that before. And that really was personally what kicked it off for me. Suddenly this idea of design was very real. And you could start to approach biology as technology. And that ultimately is what we're trying to do here at CC, take this approach and put it into the work we're trying to do. Now, please don't take that as some sort of glib statement. You know, hey, biology is technology. It is seriously difficult. Read Nature, read Science. It is hard stuff to do. But the important thing is the intent, that we're trying to do this and we're willing to take that challenge on head on and say, can we try and use biology as a technology? So this is where we end up. Because we're thinking of it as a technology, we say, no, we can try and get a process here and understand how we move it forward. We can map out the journey of how we get from the cool science and where we get to solving the global issues. And if we've got a map, we have some idea where we're sitting in that journey at any point in time. And this is typically how we think of the world in terms of the process you go through. So at the one end, you've got the understanding, the cool science bit, just what is this thing and what's going on at that very fundamental level. The thing then we're asking is the predictability. Okay, if you understand it, can you predict it? Can you actually say ahead of time what it's going to do? And how do we get that put together? Then we would ask the question of controlling it. Okay, well, if you can predict it, can you control it? Can you make it do something that you want it to do again and again? If you can control it, can we then scale it? Is there a level of homogeneity about that behaviour that you can start to scale it out, or is it actually much more localised and heterogeneous and you've got all those problems arriving? And if you can scale it, then we're heading to a point where we can probably start to think about delivering it. And the reason for going through this, and what I have seen often now, is this is not that well understood in many cases, and people just kind of don't know where they are. And you say, where is your technology? And they say, well, yeah, we're just about ready to deliver it. And you say, well, yeah, okay, but do you know actually what's going on? Well, no, it never does the same thing twice. All right, let's have a conversation about predictability here and actually what you've got. So we find this a very useful tool for just understanding that journey and working with all our clients, saying, well, actually, where are you? And understanding the reality of whether even some of this can be done. There are times where you just look, we cannot get control of that. Doesn't matter how hard we're trying, there is something there we don't understand. We just have to take that and try and move forward from that point. And of course, all this has to be done within the appropriate economic and governance models. It's not done in isolation. All the questions about responsible innovation, is this something we, society, are willing to accept, has to be in there. And of course, the economics of this, the realities of how much is this going to cost? Is there a return on this? How long do you think it might take us to get through this little journey? That all becomes part of it as well. So hopefully that gives you a feel for kind of the process we go through and how we try and move from one thing to the next. Springing from the fact we're saying, no, this is just another technology. This is not something different or separate. It's a technology. We can think about it, understand it. So that's one part of it. The other part is the multidisciplinary approach. Now, CC Cambridge has been doing this for some time. The idea of bringing teams together with multidisciplinary approaches, that's not new. What we are doing here is absolutely pushing that to the max and just getting totally separate disciplines to come together to deliver. And that gives us the ability to tackle all sorts of interesting problems because you have those skill sets coming together. So, for example, biology and computation. Can you apply things like machine learning to understand, genotype to phenotype, those kind of things? We can bring those two together. Biology and engineering. Can we actually physically build a bit of kit that lets us manufacture something and get it to the market? Computation and engineering, that's an interesting one because a lot of the work around the research side and automation and just how do you do rapid research. So by bringing them together, you start to be able to address a lot of issues. Most interestingly, of course, is the centre. And here, what we're seeing is opening up a whole new axis of innovation, if you like. So the classic system approach is in hardware and software typically. Do I write some code or do I physically make something? And you kind of make a balance between the two. What we're now seeing is that if you start to treat biology as a technology, you open up a third axis and you say, okay, do I find a best solution software, hardware, or do I change the biology? Because that's actually a better solution overall. So a good example of that is in fermentation processes, engineering the organisms so they're more temperature tolerant. So what's easier to do, to go through all the hassle of making my tank better controlled, or just putting something in it that better manages the situation? And that's where it gets really interesting. And that idea that you can take all these disciplines and in some way trade off between them, that starts to give you some interesting tools and techniques, particularly if you put that in that broader context of, well, just how mature is this technology for real? And let's not kid ourselves, just where we've got to. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into kind of our approach and how we try to do this. The other important thing about this is just throwing the people together. The mutual incomprehension between an engineer and a biologist is beautiful to behold when you start. I mean, just like, no idea what they're talking about. Give them 6 months, they quickly latch on to each other's way of thinking. And that's really interesting because biologists really very quickly latch on to the idea of composability, repeatability, systematic approaches. They very quickly latch onto it. Similarly, the engineers really latch onto the idea of massive parallelization, extreme miniaturization, all the things that biology allows you to do. And we're finding that extremely powerful, just letting the people understand each other. And then, of course, they're able to make these trade-offs in a much more sensible way between the conversations. Again, that's very much work in progress, but we're having a lot of fun doing it, and the level of comprehension is definitely rising. So we're not alone in thinking like this. There's a quote here from Ryan Bethencourt. So he runs a startup over in San Francisco, IndieBio. We know Ryan really quite well, and we have our offices around that area, and we're in and out of IndieBio on a fairly regular basis because there's always someone interesting to talk to at IndieBio, and they're always doing something fun. But the reason I put this up, you can see, is because that idea, it's not just us thinking like this in this way. Ryan also is this idea that the world is built on biology. Once we begin to understand it, it becomes a technology, and you can start to use it in that way. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a view kind of where we're coming from and how we view the world. It's a work in progress, and please don't take this as we've got all the answers, but it's helping us really well. And to try and prove that, I was just going to do a few case studies, just projects we've worked on which tries to put some of this thinking into action. You may already have all seen this one. So this is the Bacilli Demo that's out in the hub there. Some work we did last year. This is all about TB diagnosis, or TB management to be more precise. So TB diagnosis is typically done molecularly now, things like PCR amplification. But the trouble is it's a latent condition and you have to keep monitoring people. That is difficult to do because the molecular tests are too expensive. You just can't keep testing them every time on a molecular test. So the typical approach is still doing a stain and looking at it. That is the sort of standard of care for monitoring. And that's really difficult to do, mostly because it takes a long time and people are looking down microscopes for hour after hour after hour, still checking it off. So we had a bit of a think about that and said, could we find a better way of doing it? What we ended up with was actually using an AI approach, as a deep learning algorithm, a smartphone and a cheap microscope. The idea being here, could we take the biology, the hardware, the software, and find a really good compromise that would give you great performance cheap? And that's where we ended up. So if you go and see the demo, you'll see it all up and running live. It's actually not got TB in it, you'll be pleased to hear. That's another mycobacterium. It's a Valbellini strain, which is generally regarded as safe. So you're quite willing to, the slides look great, but they're not TB. But it's a really good example of that three-way optimization, saying, look, we're trying to do it cheap, we're trying to make it really accessible to the users. How do we go between those three disciplines and make a really nice product out of it? And the case here is two things. Firstly, getting the AI small enough to go on the phone, so it'll run on the phone. And secondly, quite a lot of careful thought in the biological side about providing data ultimately. How do you get enough samples to build an AI that you can train up? So there's some interesting work in finding alternative bugs and things like that, just to give you a mechanism to even get through it. So that's one example in the sort of healthcare space. The next one, we talked earlier about cell therapies. We've done a lot of work recently in cell and gene therapies, particularly around the manufacturing and scale-up. The idea of cell therapies is really changing pharma quite radically in many ways, because it's such a different approach in terms of what the product is and how you deliver it to patients. Mostly today the therapies are made by hand, highly trained people in environments like this. Anyone's been to pharma manufacturing, that'll be a very familiar environment. It's a very, very controlled, difficult environment, very highly trained people, very manual processes, and it just doesn't add up right now. We can't make them fast enough or at a cost point that allows them to get out into the world that desperately needs these things. And of course, typically they're on a per patient basis. Every dose you make is unique to the patient because it came from their source material. Lots and lots of challenges there. So what we've been doing, we worked with one of the major pharma companies to totally rethink how you make cell therapies. They wanted to go right back to, guys, we've got to fix this problem. How do we really make these at cost and speed and just availability across the world? And this was a massive cross-disciplinary question, because you can imagine all the things you've got to get right in terms of the engineering, the software, the control systems, actually making the biology work, trying to bring that lot together. There's certainly a lot more to it than let's get some cells and keep them warm. It's a very complex thing to try and do. Particularly where we got heavily into this was actually around the measurement and characterization part. So how do you know what the biology is doing, and can you better manage and control that biology? And particularly, again, starting to think about, well, what else can you do within the biological realm, because you're doing a genetic modification anyway. How can you be using the biology to better make a process? There's something about that change the biology that allows you to measure it or characterize it or control it in some way. So that's another great example of that overlap and saying, let's think a little bit differently. Could we do something in that biological sphere that unlocks a whole bunch of ideas in the other disciplines and ultimately allows us to deliver the product that's needed. Changing tack completely, we do some really great stuff in this company. Plastic waste management. It's an increasingly high profile area. I'm sure you just got to read the papers. This idea that we have problem with plastic, it's not a problem with the plastic per se, it's the management of it, is getting very prevalent. So this is some work we did back in the summer, and this is within collaboration with Hitachi. There was a press release went out. So Hitachi have started an innovation forest partnership program. So this is Hitachi looking to collaborate with companies all around the world to get innovation and deliver innovation that answers society's challenges. So it's an interesting spin on it. The question is about answering society challenges. So we went over to Japan, we worked with them over the summer in their central research labs, and what we were trying to understand is how can synthetic biology be applied to the problem of plastic waste. Now, that's taken off in the last few years. I'm sure you know, 2016 I think it was, the discovery of the organism in a waste dump in Japan that was actually eating the PET. It had mutated, as biology loves to do, it evolves, and it's starting degrading the plastic. And this organism was discovered. Not surprisingly, people are now running with that and saying, what's the mechanism? Can we improve the performance? Can we actually turn this into a real process at scale to solve this kind of thing? So the work we did, going back to the theme of bioinnovation, it's across all the disciplines, a little bit of technical work because there are real questions about speed and yield, but far bigger questions around the economics and the governance of that. What is the business model? Who's going to pay for it? Why do they care? How does that fit within different societies in the world? Different societies have different views on waste, different levels of recycling and their comfort or discomfort with recycling. So it's a very interesting project where we actually had to say, well, can you make this overall idea work in that complete context, not just can we make a bug that does the job? We got some really good results out of that, some very interesting conclusions from that, but I just wanted to give it as an example of that entire bioinnovation, and you have to work across all of them if you're actually going to make this real and not just, hey, it's cool science in a lab, look, it's eating my plastic bottle. The last example, catalogue. So this is storage of digital data in DNA. So the big challenge we have, and I had no idea about this till I read it about a year ago, under current projections, by about 2050, we'll need all the electrical energy on the planet just to keep the server farms running. And we'll have run out of silicon to make all the chips by then as well. I had no idea the scale of the problem, but the sheer tide and torrent of data that is being made now, in not too distant future, hopefully maybe within my lifetime, what are we going to do? We won't have the resources to store it all. And so from that, people are looking at alternative techniques for data storage. And we've been working with our friends at Catalogue to try and find ways of putting data into DNA. That's not a new idea. What Catalogue came up with was a very elegant encoding scheme, and what we did was turn that into reality. So we now have the machine built here in Cambridge. We're now writing digital data at about megabit a second sort of rates, and we're storing gigabits of data into DNA. So it's a great example of a biological starting point, but then actually scaling it and turning it into something that is actually commercially and usefully relevant, or a step towards. I mean, even at megabits per second, you've still got a reasonable way to go, but it gives you a good stepping stone on the way. So that's about 1,000 times faster than previous state of the art, as far as we can tell right now. And that happened here. And the reason it happened is brilliant team from Catalogue, but again, that multidisciplinary bit. We had a bunch of molecular biologists who really know how DNA works and how to put it together. We had a bunch of mechanical engineers who know how to do all the difficult mechanical stuff, and a bunch of software and computational people who understand how to put all the computational part together as well. So it's a great example of the multidisciplinary approach. And I love this picture. That's Wikipedia. That's what actually comes out at the end. So you start off with the digital file, and after a little bit of processing, you get that, and that's Wikipedia. Now you dry it, obviously, for long-term storage, but that was the outcome of that particular processing. So hopefully, we ought to wrap up. I promised you a little bit of a tour around what bioinnovation is, and going from cool science to global issues, and some of the techniques and ideas that we're using to try and make that real. So the core take-homes really is that, to our mind, bioinnovation is much more than tech. It's the combination of the technology, the economics, and the governance. That you can think of biology as a technology. It's not easy, but it can be done, and you have to think of it in that way. And the only way you ultimately deliver is by bringing the disciplines together. You have to get that group who really understand each other and really talk each other's language, and that can take a little bit of time, but it can be done. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight, at least where our heads are at in this topic. Our time is pretty much up. If there are any questions, absolutely delighted to answer them. Otherwise, we'll be heading into lunch. So thank you very much.
I just have a question about this tuberculosis app.
Yeah.
Where's the AI? So can't you just count the viruses or bacteria with image processing?
So we looked, that question of why have we used that kind of approach rather than just a more traditional.
What do you use AI for?
Yeah. So I will try my best to answer that. Then you probably want to go and talk to my colleagues on the stand who will have deeper insights. But certainly two things. One, it's partly to do with the broad applicability. So although TB is one instance, we were looking for a technology that if you wanted to look for something different, you wouldn't have to completely reprogram the entire thing. You just give it a new set of data, say now go and look for that, and it would have the ability to go and look for something else. So it's partly that flexibility, if you like, the ability to change what you're looking for relatively straightforwardly. And secondly, just a pure performance thing. When you actually start saying, where is my individual organism within a sea of protein and all the other junk, it really gets quite tricky, and we end up saying, look, it's just going to be easier, rather than trying to find some forward-looking way to identify that. We'll just let it work it out for itself. That just proved to be a better way of doing it. Does that give some?
Absolutely.
Yeah, good, thank you.
You mentioned that there's this whole framework of mutual incomprehensibility.
Yes.
A lot of technology is very tactile. You've got widgets, you've got circuits, and that's the typical space that innovation works in. And certainly you've got the soft stuff and
yes.
the chemistry and the biology coming in. So how do these guys actually? Is there a lot of interfacing even in terms of the hardware that
yes.
allows them to work together?
Yes, there is. Yeah. So that question about how the reality of what biology looks like. So yes, first thing we did, we built a lab. So we have our own wet labs here in the building, proper microbiology labs. Anyone who works in that field will recognise them immediately with all the stuff in there. And that was a very important part of the process. So we can't do this in the abstract. We actually have to have a lab with equipment in and get engineers in that lab seeing what happens. At the end of the day, it's lots of very small volumes of clear liquid typically. But once they see it happening, they quickly latch onto the concepts and very quickly start to see the challenges as well. When you watch a molecular biologist at work, realising what they're up against. So we tried very hard to make it as real as we could. And the first step was just getting the infrastructure, a real lab with real highly trained biologists in it who could do all the processes and protocols. And suddenly everyone's going, oh, right, that's what it looks like. So that's how so that's been a big part of it. Get hands-on.
I'll just ask a quick question about whether you have any either self-imposed or government-imposed legal or ethical constraints when you're delving.
Absolutely, absolutely,
Okay.
Absolutely.
How do you make that judgment?
So it's all on the basis of risk, ultimately. So clearly there are the legal constructs within the UK. We're registered with the HSE for the work we do. We're registered for genetic modification. So there's that level of basic compliance with the law. You have to have that in place. Then it's very much on a case-by-case basis. A client comes to us saying we're looking at X. Then we as an organisation have to make that judgment. How does that fit across a whole spectrum of views in terms of responsibility of innovation? And that's why, for example, we got heavily involved in some of these other projects, because it's a very dynamic, fluid field at the moment. It's a really interesting dynamic that there are some very difficult problems out there, and the solutions require some pretty radical thinking about what's acceptable to society. And I don't have good answers for that, but we try to engage in the dialogue. But personally, we do it on a sort of case-by-case basis. And ultimately, a large part of it is judging the risk it might be, both from a safety perspective, but also ultimately for a reputational perspective. At some point, you have to say, society is just not willing to accept that right now, therefore it's not the right thing to be doing, regardless of how clever it is, and regardless of how brilliant it might be, what it could deliver, it's just not acceptable right now. So that's how we try and do it. But it's a very key part of what we do, and that's really why this morning I tried to give it that bigger picture, that it's not just a tech focus.
Could I just follow that in terms of the international regime? How do you find access and benefit sharing, things like compliance with the Goya protocol in terms of getting the genetic materials that you need for overseas? How do you find all that?
It's been okay so far. But we kind of see problems coming. Obviously the big challenge around Goya is the whole question of who owns what. Because when you start synthesizing, you're synthesizing your genome, the question of who, in a geographical sense, owns an asset gets very interesting at that point. So we haven't come across any problems yet, but you're kind of keeping an eye open. And I guess very pragmatically from a business perspective, similar to what we were just saying, if there is just no way past it, we just can't, then we just have to say no, we just can't do it. The legal structures and the society view is just not there.
Yes, one last point. Organizationally, because you're basically consulting as an organization, is the lab something that comes first, or is the project something that comes first? How do you build the capability? And there's a chicken and egg there. But
Good question. That's the classic dilemma of this kind of organisation. You know, how far ahead do you invest? Because ultimately the revenue comes from the project. In this context, we invested in the facilities first. There's no way you could be credible going to most life sciences companies saying, yeah, we do synthetic biology. Don't have a lab, but we do synthetic biology. Just doesn't wash. So in this case, we recognised we had to make that investment. Didn't have a choice really. If you're going to have any credibility, you have to be able to show physical stuff. So we've been investing quite heavily ahead of the curve in this whole area. I mean, going back to a few years ago when CC as a company decided this was an important new sort of area of development that we should be coming into. That's then played out in those kind of investments, both in terms of physical infrastructure and of course the people, the brains who know what they're actually doing.
Just follow up, how do you find the people for that? Because half of my life was bioinformatician, so I was in the middle because I worked with a lot of computational scientists, I work in a lot of biologists. Myself as biologist, I understand the computing, but you have got another one, now the engineering.
Yeah.
I mean, people.
It's a really interesting question, and what I've observed is there is a new cohort coming through of life scientists who are a lot more savvy around engineering and computation than they ever used to be. So if I look at some of the much more, the sort of, people coming through their PhDs and first postdoc level, they're really much more familiar with this than they would have been otherwise. And the idea of I write a bit of computer code or I might use a robot just doesn't faze them at all. It's like, yeah, well, of course you would. So I think that's where I'm seeing the long term, that set of skills is being developed in the academic training environment, which then allows organisations like ours to build on and say, great, you kind of get this. More senior roles, we accept there's a bit of a learning curve, and all you have to do is find the people who are willing to take on the challenge. And we're quite open as part of that process of finding people. So, guys, you are going to have to get your head around this. Are you up for it or not? And some people just aren't. Say, well, that's not, if the answer is I'm not interested or it's not my area, well, it's kind of, okay, that's not very helpful to me. But we've been fortunate, we found people who are up for the challenge, basically, and say, although I'm a biologist by original training, I'm happy to learn. I can find some stuff out, I'm smart. And that's the kind of mindset we've been looking for.
Just a quick one. I'm interested in if you have any views on the kind of public perceptions of SynBio, because it has had some kind of PR difficulties in the past, and whether you think it's simply a matter of branding, if you like, and public perception associated with branding, or whether you think, how far do you think the SynBio community's got to go before you can win over public opinion, because it's been a tricky, bumpy ride?
It has, and there's lots and lots of observations I would make there. So first, I get very worried if it's just a branding exercise. You shouldn't be sort of trying to gloss over stuff. There is definitely that need for not just synthetic biology, but this whole idea about we can manipulate biological systems in a much more fundamental way than we ever could do. Is that a good or a bad thing? Society-wide, discuss. That conversation still has to play out. I think what I have been seeing is, to be honest, people are getting just more interested in the outcomes. SynBio is a tool, it's a way of viewing the world and a way of getting stuff done. To the vast majority of the population, could be called anything. The question is, do I get a great product and does it help me? And that seems to be a view that is now starting to propagate a little more. Certainly we were at SynBio Beta over in the US a couple of months ago, and that's changed hugely in the last 2 or 3 years. The emphasis about it's all synthetic biology, it's now becoming, no, what can we get out of it and what do we deliver? And I suspect that's part of the solution. It's not obsessing about what the tech is or what we call it. It's a much more fundamental question of what good can it do, what useful things can it deliver, and then what's that risk reward that we're willing to accept. That's where my head's on that one. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for all your questions. Really appreciate those.